Okay, so today I will be presenting about a research area that has drawn my fascination over the course of the semester. While it can be generally described as pertaining to language deprivation and communication abuse that's specific to the deaf and hard of hearing, this, of course, is a large umbrella for many different things that I was able to learn from the articles I chose for my literature review. So the information I will be covering today does go in many different directions, but that sort of represents my mess of interest for the time being. Okay, coming into this process of selecting a research topic, I already had existing interest in two lines of research, so I knew that I would want to select articles that capitalize on these areas and explore the potential for them to be tied together into one hypothesis. Looking at number one, there has been evidence in past literature that deaf and hard of hearing exhibit significant behavioral and emotional problems that have been tied to their experiences of abuse, which is typically more prevalent compared to rates observed in their hearing peers. And then moving into number two, another vein of interest is that deaf children can experience communication isolation within their families, which can also be considered a form of trauma that they're subjected to. So that sort of begged a question for me as to how might this create an environment in which a deaf child is uniquely vulnerable to abuse? And is this during childhood, or how does it pose them for a risk of trauma in later life? And I essentially chose articles that fell under one of these two umbrellas and let that guide me where it did. Regarding deaf individuals, I do believe that access to communication and traumatization and their experiences of that may go hand in hand. Information deprivation trauma is a concept that's been studied, and it sort of bridges the two concepts of limited language exposure or language deprivation and traumatic experiences in deaf individuals. There was a study done by Schild and Dahlenberg in 2011 that sampled deaf individuals exposed to traumatic events, and they observed that IDT, which I'll abbreviate information deprivation trauma, in this sample suggested that impaired communication or lack of incidental learning or information could exacerbate factors related to trauma. However, this also lent to my curiosity as to how communication isolation through the deprivation of language could act as a predicting factor for trauma exposure in those who are deaf. So at the bottom of the slide here, although I know this is premature given that my literature review is in its early stages, I did have a tentative research question in mind based on my own speculations. So I listed that here. Right. The past literature does make it pretty clear that individuals with disabilities are at higher risk for childhood maltreatment. They're also more likely to suffer from multiple types of childhood maltreatment, and they tend to be victimized at an earlier age, and they're more likely to experience it in the home environment. However, of course, levels of risk for being victimized vary based on the exact disability. That being said, I did note a gap in the literature where we seem to be lacking studies of childhood trauma for specific disability subtypes. And I think more of these are warranted in the literature because obviously we can expect or anticipate significant heterogeneity as a function of the disability type. There was a study done in 2014 that used the childhood trauma questionnaire, which is 28 items long, and it assesses 5 different types of childhood maltreatment that occur prior to age 16. And the researchers used a sample of deaf and hard of hearing and matched hearing college students. And as expected, based on what's been evidenced in past literature, rates of physical and sexual abuse were double what was observed in hearing peers. They were that much higher for deaf and hard of hearing. And there were significantly higher rates of emotional maltreatment in deaf and hard of hearing compared to hearing participants. And they were also shown to experience a higher number of different types of childhood maltreatment. So this was another, I think, important rate to pay attention to, high numbers of poly-victimization amongst deaf and hard of hearing youth, which is considered being exposed to multiple forms of victimization. This could be crime, abuse, neglect, and it places children at particularly high risk for maladjustment. And this yields very important implications, I think, given the high prevalence rates that we've seen amongst deaf children. It's important to consider how this could be a strong predictor of later trauma symptomatology, suicide risk, and later re-victimization in later life. So to go on and add a little bit more detail, but this also pulls from the same evidence that I was just talking about. It's the same study. This article examined, once again, the prevalence of child maltreatment and lifetime exposure to other traumatic events in that same sample of deaf and hard of hearing and matched hearing college students. And I just want to tease out the most important takeaways from the article. So overall, this reaffirms what we might have expected, that deaf and hard of hearing participants reported significantly more instances of childhood maltreatment. And childhood maltreatment was a significant predictor for later re-victimization in adulthood. And I believe they used the traumatic life events questionnaire in order to assess lifetime trauma exposure. Okay, so what is the risk calculus for these prevalence rates? It seems that the likelihood of victimization for deaf and hard of hearing increased with the concurrent level of demonstrated hearing loss. This was such that deaf participants reported more instances of maltreatment than hard of hearing participants, who subsequently reported more instances than hearing participants. And I think some of the important takeaways from this are that increased hearing loss is likely tied to greater communication barriers that are confronted between parents and their children. And then lower levels of communication ability could stress the familial dynamic, I think, that deaf children are raised in. Parents might experience increased levels of frustration and resort to harsher discipline strategies, which increases the risk of emotional and physical maltreatment. And communication isolation can also harm the child's ability or hinder their ability to report abuse or talk about it with others. And that is an additive risk for their victimization because they do make better targets for perpetrators. And in the context of the previous findings, we know that they've shown nearly doubled rates of physical and sexual abuse compared to their hearing peers. There are also significantly higher rates of emotional maltreatment. And I think this is particularly relevant to the cultural context of deaf and hard of hearing populations, especially given that a majority of children are born to hearing parents. It sort of speaks to the quality of parent-child relationships and family dynamics that may be significantly compromised. That inability to communicate with family members is tied to overall a lower quality of life. How they perceive themselves is truly impacted. I know that the literature has evidenced a lot of depressive symptomatology, such as low self-esteem, feelings of shame, guilt, worthlessness, and things like that. Sure why it keeps. Okay. So returning to the information deprivation trauma model, I think in light of these findings, it really reinforces the fact that we should make efforts to reduce social isolation that the deaf and hard of hearing might experience. And how do we do that? By promoting more effective communication with caregivers, family members, and their peers. And this can be done by promoting learning and development via the use of ASL, signed English, or other forms of communication. Hearing loss overall can truly limit incidental learning, which many hearing people are able to benefit from simply by obtaining auditory information that we have easy access to in our immediate environments, things that we don't even think of, such as the radio, the television, or even conversations that we overhear. The deaf person's inability to access these environmental cues can significantly impair or impact how they're able to cope and engage in appropriate healthcare practices, behaviors, their health communication and safety behaviors. So I think by enabling better, more accessible and clear communication, this could lower trauma risk and provide increased support if trauma occurs. So in light of the findings we've reviewed, which evidence that deaf and hard of hearing children typically are already facing greater social isolation due to their reduced access to language, this sort of it serves as an additive or exacerbating factor that makes the influence of child neglect, if experienced, that much worse or significantly higher for deaf children. It places them at higher risk for worse psychological and cognitive development. And on top of that, this can sort of be explained by language deprivation being tied to neurodevelopmental underpinnings. As I read in the literature, all children do need regular and frequent exposure to an accessible language during what's considered the critical or sensitive period, which I think is between birth and 3 or 4 years of age, or else if they don't get that exposure, then they risk linguistic deprivation. So yeah, some of the factors listed here include decreased gray matter. It inhibits their fluency in any language because of that inability to establish a firm foundation in a first primary language that really hinders their ability to become fluent in any language throughout later life. So again, very important implications behind linguistic neglect. Okay. Right. Let me move my down here. So severe language deprivation can be considered its own mental health disorder, which I think is really important to consider in a sociocultural context. There was an article I read, which I liked because it presented this as a public health concern and essentially said that not protecting children or deaf children against this syndrome could qualify as severe neglect. Really limiting a child's social communication can yield severe consequences, such as stunting their development of a healthy, strong sense of self and really inhibiting their development of resiliency when dealing with adversity. Anyone left without social communication is left without health communication, which could be another instance of neglect. And just as hearing loss as a biological constraint can affect access to spoken language, we know that. Also decisions that are made by professionals, medical professionals, in particular hearing science professionals, those decisions that they make when advising hearing parents of deaf children and recommending or advising them to exclude exposure to sign language, that can really impair and affect their access to language and is also a social constraint. And it takes away the child's privilege of social communication. If a deaf child has deficits in any form, it's typically assumed that these can be explained away by their deafness. But instead, I think it's missing the point that it could also be chalked up to this social constraint, such as the lack of action on the part of caregivers, who I think should be called upon to take more accountability and responsibility for these incredibly crucial decisions that guide the language development, in particular, of deaf children that are being raised by hearing parents who basically do not know better and are deferring to the expertise of others. So I think this really does call attention to the responsibility of public policy, which does not currently consider that the fact that these harms are preventable or avoidable, and that basically these influential heavyweights should be held responsible for avoiding these harms. So the status of sign language as a bona fide language has not really been understood or adopted by medical professionals and society at large. I think this also includes child welfare services, educational policy perspectives, and also cochlear implant manufacturers and the medical profession usually offer treatments or cures for deafness. So again, I think that reinforces the fact that it's important to increase training, general social awareness, and understanding that language acquisition can occur in various modalities, and nothing is sacrificed by relying on a modality outside of speech, and that there are benefits to visual access to language in the form of sign language, especially because social stigma and misinformation kind of go hand in hand. These, I do think, collectively attribute to deaf children's language and cognitive deficits, which in turn contribute to subsequent maltreatments that deaf might be subjected to. So I think this really calls upon professionals to give early and well-informed advice to parents of deaf children and make sure they know that exposure to sign language is the most effective way to protect their child's psychosocial and cognitive health. And really, sign language should not be posed as a competing option to a speech-based approach. I think it should be posed as more of an inclusive option. And again, it calls upon educators, hearing science professionals, the CI industry, and so on, that they have a responsibility to protect deaf children against linguistic neglect. Right. Okay, so given that what we've discussed so far, if we see developmental difficulties of any type in deaf and hard of hearing, we can see that it's not, we shouldn't be so quick to assume that these are necessarily attributable to language or communication disorders or cognitive deficits. They may actually be explained by communication and language development challenges, largely due to inaccessible language throughout development by virtue of the child being deaf. This is definitely relevant to the majority of deaf children who are born to hearing parents and usually unable to access the primary modality of the family's language, which is usually speech. Given the discussion of language development as being modality independent, it has been suggested in the literature that mental health functioning in adolescence is related to an early and consistent mode match between mother and child, rather than depending specifically on the type of modality itself. Whether they use speech or sign, it might not matter. It may just, this effect may be specific to a healthier mental profile being observed in those who have a shared language established with others. As we may have already guessed, deaf children of signing deaf parents typically show better outcomes in terms of language, academic functioning, and psychosocial adjustment. However, is this finding restricted to the fact that, okay, it's because they're using a visual language that happens to be matched? Or is it largely explained by the fact that, no, it's a shared mode of communication that's largely beneficial, regardless of whether they use sign or speech? Can this apply to other language modalities? So this theory was tested in 2004. I know that the participants were taken from a 15-year longitudinal database that covered children and adolescents with severe and profound deafness. And data was gathered on the child's and the mother's language experience, and they also looked at the child's mental health functioning using a self-report, which was a culturally and linguistically adapted measure, and it's widely used to assess child and adolescent psychopathology. And they were then split into 3 groups. The first being auditory oral, which meant that they engage in spoken English. They had engaged in spoken English both in early childhood and in adolescence, as did their mothers. The sign match group were those who began signing relatively early in childhood, usually before age 5, and continued to sign into adolescence, as did their mothers. And then the sign mismatch group were those who used sign in adolescence, but not in early childhood, and had a mother who did not. So really exposure occurred later and was not ongoing. And then they had deaf children of deaf parents. Right. So this was a more direct study of the relationship of language itself to mental health. I think the authors were trying to sort of like disentangle the effects of language mode, experience, and parental hearing status. So they were investigating the relationship between early developmentally continuous mode match between hearing mothers and their deaf children, and then how that would bear an effect on subsequent mental health functioning in adolescence. So lo and behold, these results sort of, I think they did support the notion of an importance of an early and consistent mode match between children and their mothers. As might have been anticipated, of course, the deaf of deaf group had the healthiest scores out of across the groups overall. They were the only group that had a common and barrier-free language with their parents from birth. But even further, moving on to number 2, this effect was persistent, independent of communication modality. So meaning that if their language preferred communication or language was compatible, they would still, that would subsist a healthy mental health profile. So those with healthier results were the groups that shared an early and ongoing match with their mothers. So this finding also applied to those who were auditory oral, subscribing to spoken English that matched speech or speech-based approach that matched that of their parents, and the sign match groups. However, while mothers in the sign match group did begin to sign at roughly the same time as their children, they were not native signers. Hearing parents typically, I think, acquire only modest levels of skill in sign, even after considerable use and practice. So this sort of reinforces the importance of fostering proficient sign language use amongst parents of deaf children who sign. So I think that also might have explained why, even with communication compatibility, the deaf of deaf group had the healthiest score profile, because there was likely more proficiency on the part of the deaf parents in that matched language. While with the other groups, I'm sure there were sacrifices made. Even though languages were compatible, I doubt that they were on the same level of proficiency when looking at the child versus the parent. So this is consistent with a lot of the previous research that's been done on this topic. And this present study found that communication mode mismatch of parents, teachers, and deaf adolescents can really hinder the development of normal relationships and lead to other socio-emotional problems and adjustment issues in later life. Okay, so tying this information into my second research area of interest, communication abuse may play a significant role as an explanatory factor for subsequent trauma or other abuse experienced by those with hearing loss. And these language and developmental delays that are a product of inaccessible language throughout development could ultimately contribute to this. So tying this together, it seems particularly exigent given past findings which show nearly doubled prevalence rates of psychological, physical, and sexual intimate partner violence that deaf college and community women are subjected to. All right, so in review of past literature covering intimate partner violence, there has been more of a focus on partners that are compatible in regards to hearing status, language or communication preferences, and less so of a focus on hearing deaf relationships, which really show great differential in this area. Really no empirical work has been done on the prevalence or correlates of intimate partner violence that might be observed between couples that identify as hearing deaf. And this is crucial to investigate because I think it introduces many factors of potential incompatibility, such as differences in hearing status, language or communication preferences, and these can really affect the course of their ability to work through communication breakdowns that most couples face, and whether they're more likely to resort to nonviolent conflict resolution, or if they're likely to resort to more physical and severe methods. Um, Culturally deaf individuals are usually more likely to prefer partners who exhibit similar culturally deaf characteristics, including comparable hearing status, cultural identity, mode of communication, and comparable educational background. But communication compatibility is up there as prioritized primarily by most. And typically reviewing the past literature, how of what's usually expected to be observed in a violent relationship is two partners who lack communication skills. So during instances of conflict, that's when these communication deficits really come through. And that's why it's incredibly important to look at the implications of hearing deaf relationships and how they resolve conflict and the potential for it to escalate into IPV, because there is no equally accessible, or there may not be an equally accessible, equally fluent form of communication, and it may not be shared between the two partners. So without establishing a communication foundation, that task of developing skilled nonviolent conflict resolution can really feel or become impossible. So there is great potential for a power imbalance when disproportionate value is given to English over ASL as a preferred communication method, or when one partner does not have equal access to the majority language. And that power differential between partners is tied to an increased risk of psychological abuse, physical aggression, and really life-threatening violence. So this study focused on culturally deaf individuals who primarily use ASL. And they were recruited from Gallaudet University, and they self-identified as either deaf or hard of hearing. And again, the authors were looking into the characteristics and prevalence rates of IPV victimization in hearing deaf and deaf-deaf relationships. So comparisons were made based on whether hearing status was matched or mismatched. The revised conflict tactics scale was used, and it's the most widely used measure for identifying IPV. And the items were able to be differentiated between acts of minor versus severe violence. So the outcome of this study was not necessarily what we anticipated it to be. Although we did observe increased levels of negotiation, and negotiation meaning a nonviolent means of conflict resolution, being able to communicate with each other clearly and constructively when resolving disagreements. Although that was observed to be increased on the basis of compatible hearing status and communication preference, overall, it did not really account for any significant difference or particularly any decrease in prevalence rates of IPV. It didn't seem to have any bearing on a reduction in psychological aggression, physical assault, or injury when comparing relationships that were compatible versus not in the area of hearing status and communication preference. Although and this was despite the fact that negotiation was higher in these groups when they were compatible in these areas, but it still seemed to have no significant effect on any reduction in physical, psychological, or sexual partner violence. And actually, hearing status compatible relationships, such as culturally deaf individuals dating other alike deaf and hard of hearing partners, these relationships were actually characterized by significantly higher rates of sexual coercion than hearing status incompatible relationships. This might be explained by limited IPV, health literacy amongst deaf and hard of hearing. They may be lacking info based on reduction in auditory incidental learning about what constitutes IPV, the acceptability of violence and alternate strategies to resolve conflict. So again, a lot of, if there is language deprivation present or they're missing a lot of auditory information that would be beneficial to them, they may be sort of delayed or behind in developing healthy communication behaviors, especially health communication overall and how they establish it with others. And all of these could be attributed to a fund of information deficits. So along with this surprising finding, I think another thing of note was that compatible relationships had a significantly higher prevalence rate of minor sexual coercion. However, hearing status incompatible relationships, comparatively speaking, had a higher prevalence rate of severe sexual coercion, such as involving physical force. So although this difference didn't really reach statistical significance, it still could suggest that more instrumental or severe sexual coercion is more likely when there is a differential in hearing status, because there is the potential to abuse hearing privilege in hearing deaf relationships. And although the language preference compatibility was looked at as a factor that may influence the occurrence of partner violence, the authors didn't really they did not directly investigate communication skills within that shared language. So we can't assume that the partners shared effective interpersonal and communication skills, even if they claimed to share the same language. They may have different levels of proficiency still. So I think that's something important to consider. Having a shared language foundation is by no means the only necessary condition for effective communication. I think skill level is also important. So moving on, there is a general lack of consensus surrounding what exactly defines abuse across the literature. For specific to IPV, it seems that definitions have been widely variable, and this can leave abuse survivors sort of struggling to label their own experiences of violence. We have the pervasive abuse script, which occurred pretty frequently or was mentioned by a lot of IPV experts, and it's considered a fairly strict and stereotyped definition that most people have adopted or think of when the term abuse is used. However, it does not account for an entire spectrum of abuse experiences that don't fit the pervasive abuse criteria. If deaf women do subscribe to this pervasive abuse script, how do they go on to process or define their own experiences of violence if they happen to fit that script or if they don't? And what are their strategies in processing this information and coping? So this next study aimed to look at the prevalence of intimate partner violence experienced by deaf female undergraduates and look at what proportion of these behaviors were identified as abuse. So as you can see, this study was conducted by the same authors that performed the previous study that we looked at, which also used a sample of deaf female undergraduates that were recruited from Gallaudet University. But instead, they were looking at the effects of partner hearing status. The setup was fairly similar regarding materials used. They used victimization subscales of negotiation, psychological aggression, physical assault, and injury. And this study was more of the exploratory nature and looked at the strategies and scripts that deaf women might rely on to label their experiences with violence. And as expected, deaf women did default to the pervasive abuse script that was described on the previous slide. These results do align with the general theme of what I found in my research review. And it's not even specific to women with hearing loss, but women in general, and how they label their abusive experiences. They commonly subscribe to this pervasive, severe, injurious script. And in my opinion, this topic also touches on the important implications for supporting deaf survivors of IPV, particularly pertaining to their deaf identity. I think this line of research should be explored in order to identify how those in mental health services can help deaf survivors to affirmatively label their experiences of abuse and feel empowered to seek abuse services. But primarily my bringing up this article is that it reinforces the exigence of this and notes that, yeah, it's a huge problem. We'll move this here. Ooh. All right, so the articles covered in this review all stem from the same general underpinning or whole, like touch on the same tone of language deprivation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, cultural incompetence of professionals who are underinformed about deafness has really historically contributed to deaf children's language and cognitive deficits. Social stigma and pervasive misinformation about deafness has ultimately threatened the language acquisition of deaf people. So as you can see, it is systemic and has sociocultural roots, as was reviewed when I discussed language deprivation syndrome. And the syndrome capitalizes on language disfluency, where a deaf person's best language cannot be considered fluent, and that really impairs their ability to not only develop socio-emotionally, but function and integrate normally into society, especially if they try to pick up other languages, and their wings have sort of been clipped if they were unable to get a fair shot at establishing a first primary language foundation. Also, language difficulties contribute to a fund of knowledge deficits. This is where dinner table syndrome comes into play, which is pretty familiar in the deaf community. And it's where the normal accumulation of, I guess, passive information is not regularly accessible to deaf individuals. And I think this is a prime example of what goes on systemically in our society when deaf individuals are robbed of the opportunity to really develop and engage in language. Okay, so given the points listed here, I think that the exigence of future research on this topic is really self-evident, and it really sparks my interest in wanting to pursue it myself and hopefully make my own mark. Looking at number one, the prevalence of communication isolation and language deprivation is clear. However, literature on how this poses risk of harm to the deaf community is really limited. There was not too much for me to work with. And then moving into number two, the prevalence of maltreatment and trauma exposure, which is nearly doubled in deaf compared to hearing peers, is another clear instance of concern. And language difficulties and delays could be considered potential culprits that compound on these experiences of victimization. Unfortunately, I think insufficient research has been done on how language deprivation might manifest risk for deaf people experiencing various types of interpersonal abuse and maltreatment. A lot of published studies that I found usually focus on the educational or linguistic implications of communication isolation and abuse, instead of looking at its effect on the prevalence of interpersonal trauma in deaf community groups. So one of the main takeaways that bridges the concepts addressed in numbers 1 and 2 that I kind of hope to run with is that language deprivation and subsequent communication abuse can facilitate a power differential that endangers deaf individuals, especially given that communication deficits are most salient during instances of conflict and can really play an important role in whether arguments escalate or are de-escalated. And if they do escalate, do they escalate to a violent outcome? And these factors are important to consider because they can increase the probability of deaf individuals being victimized. So my present but very rudimentary hypothesis predicts that if a deaf individual is deprived of language, they will be more susceptible to trauma exposure, such as interpersonal or intimate partner violence. For future directions, I hope to focus more so on intimate partner violence. I know I've only tapped into it so far, especially in this presentation, but I hope to expand on it over my years here. But overall, this line of research really fascinates me because it taps into the huge consequences that come from a deaf person's inability to share equally fluent, accessible communication. There are significant implications here, and they can dictate outcomes across the lifespan. And I feel like that just simply cannot be ignored. All right, so these are my references here, but thank you so much for listening.